Robert R. Kurtz completed many missions during World War II. While during his last mission he saved another, he almost lost the chance to return home. On August 3, 1944, Kurtz and his crew aboard the Sugar Baby were shot down over the Austrian Alps. 2 German soldiers then found him below. He then protected himself with the love one man has for his children. Robert Kurtz was born on January 8, 1919 in Argonne, Ohio. Most of his childhood was spent in the Midwest, but in 1933, his family moved them miles away to White Plains, New York, where he finished his education at the local high school. Kurtz later attended the New York School of Commerce in Manhattan in 1937. He continued through 4 years at the university until he was drafted in spring of 1941, but was able to stay till graduation in July. 2 years earlier, Kurtz met his wife, Peggy, but the couple had only 3 months together before he was officially drafted into the U.S. Army. On July 23, 1941, Kurtz was inducted into the United States Army at Fort Jay in Governor's Island, New York. But right after he arrived in Governor's Island, he was asked to move to Camp Davis in Holly Ridge, North Carolina. Being at Camp Davis put Kurtz in the best physical shape of his life. He was still emotionally damaged to not seeing his wife for 5 months. German influences began to spread rapidly across Europe, which caused training progress to increase by a greater amount than before. The confirmation of the United States entering the war occurred on December 7, 1941, as Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, training for the incoming troops was pushed rapidly for them to finish their training as soon as possible. In late December of 1942, the classification board selected Kurtz to join the U.S. Air Force and to report to Ontario, California. Kurtz felt an accelerating rush when he flew the Wild Blue Yonder for the first time in Ontario. The more he flew, the more comfortable he became flying on his own without an instructor, recording PT-13B cadet biplane flight times of 3550 dual hours, 2410 solo hours, and flying a total of 60 hours before he was transferred to War Eagle Field, USAAF, in late February of 1943. At War Eagle, his training was advanced as he began to learn maneuvers on a BT-15 Valiant, a single-engine plane that was known as a good quality trainer for aviation cadets. For a total of 2 months, he continued his training in the BT-15, for a conclusion of 70 hours in the air, 40 of which being solo and 30 dual hours. On April 10, 1943, Kurtz received orders to report to Marfa Air Base Flying School in Marfa, Texas, a facility for training USAAF advanced twin-engine pilots. There he recorded a total of 2350 dual hours, 53 solo hours, and 5840 co-pilot hours in a PT-13. After graduating from War Eagle, Kurtz and his wife traveled northward to Casper Air Base in Casper, Wyoming. This is where Kurtz would go through heavy bomber training for when he was shipped overseas for war. He was assigned his crew for overseas, and on May 28, 1944, Kurtz and his crew were sent to Topeka Air Base in Kansas for their final days before being shipped overseas. They then left 10 days later with a holding of 400 hours in the sky. Kurtz then took one of his son's baby slippers and his wife the other, as he would return home again to bring the pair together at the end of war. The events that occurred the morning of August 3rd, 75 years ago, were seen by children and many families across Austria. Kurtz and his crew of a B-24 Liberator, Sugar Baby, were debriefing over their mission of that morning. This mission was Kurtz's 20th mission, over halfway to being able to return home. The crew was limited of the original 3 men, as the night before 3 of the men were in a car wreck, which left only 7 men that were familiar with the aircraft and were to have 3 replacement crew members. The crew aboard the Sugar Baby on August 3rd was built of Robert Kurtz, the co-pilot, and beside him was Lawrence Crane, the pilot. George Britton was the bombarder. The gunners consisted of Charlie Sellers, Sergeant Lawrence Hamilton, Lee Engelhorn, and Anthony Jazowski. Crew left Pantanella Air Force Base in southern Italy to proceed their mission of bombing Friedrichshafen, a German aircraft production facility that also housed liquid oxygen that was a chemical to produce rocket engines of U-2 long-range missiles. At 11:12 that morning, the crew had been right over the factory, but there was a cloud coverage that covered 9/10 of the target. Without knowing if the bombs would land where they were supposed to, Bombardier George Britton gave the signal for the bombs to be released, and the crew know they had completed the mission. But with the success of the mission came a devastating bailout. As Kurtz watch struck 11:40, they had crossed the German border, but the crew began to worry because all support in the formation was gone as the P-15 started to fade back, which was later discovered as a command from Lawrence Crane. Alerts of the weekend formation crossed the Germans' radar as 30 fighters appeared through the clouds, and in 30 seconds all 8 liberators were shot down. Sugar Baby was going up in flames as the crew began to jump out. As their only training had been jumping off a 20-foot tower, the pilot was the first out. Kurtz was preparing to jump as he heard a cry for help coming from above. Anthony Jazowski's parachute was tangled. Kurtz ran to help and untangled his parachute as they both jumped out with seconds to spare before the aircraft crashed onto the Austrian Alps. 2 members of the crew that day died in the crash, Charlie Sellers and Sergeant Lawrence Hamilton. After the air battle above Austria, all that survived the crash were captured by the Germans and forced into prisoner of war, or POW, camps. After the crash, Kurtz was injured as he had a piece of metal in his leg. He began limping down in the valley below the crash as 2 German soldiers began to rush towards him and started beating him to death. Hoping one of the soldiers about to end his life was a father or family figure, he pulled out the baby slipper of his son's, and once it caught the eye of one of the soldiers, they stopped. For if he had lost the slipper, his life would have been lost without it. 2 soldiers dragged him across the valley as Kurtz now became a prisoner of war. He was then transported to Dugloff compound in western Germany by a 48. Dugloff was Germany's main interrogation center. Allied airmen shot down over Germany would be taken here and put into solitary confinement. Prisoners would be taken one by one out of their barrack at the compound and would be asked for any information on their aircraft base location, squadron numbers, and bombing locations. Kurtz was to only say his name, rank, and serial number. 3 days of interrogation led to the same procedure. The soldiers began tired of his stubbornness of saying no intel, which led to his release of the compound shortly after. After his release, he was then taken to Stagluft 3, which was his home for the next 6 months. Arriving on August 16, 1944, 300 men from Dulg were taken to a camp hundreds of miles away. There, Kurtz was issued a creaky dog tag with a POW number on it. The number was 7241 and it was stamped across the tag. The day after the men's arrival, Robert's wife and parents had received their first word of their husband and son being alive since the notification of him and his crew crashing over the Alps. Not a day went by his family wasn't far from his thoughts. 6 days after Kurtz arrived at Stagla, he wrote his first letter to his parents saying, "After being shot down by fighters over Germany August 3rd and bailing out safely, I am now very settled at this camp with some British fellows, completely well and unharmed." Early morning of January 27th and 28th of 1945, Stagluft 3 evacuated 11,000 Krieges from the camp as Soviet Union's advancements became closer to the camp. The Death March was a 396-mile journey that took a total of 19 days. Most nights were spent walking and others were spent laying shoulder to shoulder in a church or barn that was built for half the capacity of the amount of troops. This march took them from one camp to another all over Germany. Their last destination was Stagluft 7A in Moosburg, Germany. But what the troops didn't know was that days after their arrival, they would be liberated by George Patton's Third Army on May 1st, 1945. On the 1st of May, the POW men were now free and stripped of their Kriegi name. The Red Cross placed items to the men at the camp that they had not seen in ages, such as white bread, eggs, and bacon. Due to the fact that the men's stomachs have shrunken due to their creaky diet, many of them became ill from the filling food they consumed, with the feeling of starvation. Men were taken across region to France, where they would soon be transported across the sea. The journey across the Atlantic took 14 days with no disturbance from the war. Moving into the New York harbor on May 28, 1945, Kurtz and thousands of other men that once feared the thought of travel and to where it may lead them were now arriving home. Returning home meant that the baby's slippers would be back on his son's feet and his family would become whole once more. Robert R. Kurtz and many others went through an experience most of us are unable to imagine. He suffered much of a tragedy, emotionally and physically, as he was put through many camps that messed with his mind, and later a horrid march. He was given a sense of triumph when his family was put back together, and when he left his mark in the rescue of a man he barely knew.